That evening I came back from the workshop, the smell of sawdust still clinging to my hands. The old basket I carried creaked under the weight of small wooden carvings I'd promised to sand later. The sun was sinking low, spilling that soft orange light through the windows of the house I'd built with my own hands, every beam, every nail, every memory still breathing inside these walls. Daniel was standing in the living room. He didn't look up right away. His jaw was tight, his phone in his hand like a shield. I thought maybe he wanted to talk about work or dinner or the shelf that needed fixing. But when he finally spoke, the words hit harder than any hammer I'd ever swung. "Dad," he said, "Laura and I talked. We need our own space. You being here, it's holding us back." At first, I thought I misheard him. My hand froze midair and the basket slipped from my fingers. A few nails rolled across the wooden floor, tiny echoes filling the silence he left behind. I stared at him, trying to find some trace of hesitation, some hint that he didn't mean it. There wasn't any. His eyes were calm, too calm. "I don't want this to be awkward," he added, almost like he was talking to a stranger. "We just think it's time you moved out. You'll be fine on your own." He turned away before I could answer. The door closed with a hollow thud, and for a moment, all I could hear was the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I looked around. The light flickered across the walls I once painted with Mary, my late wife. The smell of her cinnamon candles still faint in the corners of the room. I reached for the workbench near the stairs. My fingertips brushed against the spot where I'd carved Dad and Dan 1992. The letters were uneven, rough, just like the boy who'd once stood beside me, laughing as he learned to hold a chisel for the first time. For a second, it felt like I could still hear that laughter. The sound carried me back years ago, to the day I lifted him up the ladder to nail the final plank of this house. I remember telling him, "Someday this will be yours, son." He grinned, missing 2 front teeth, and said, "Then I'll build you one even better." Now he wanted me gone. I sat down slowly, feeling the weight of years press on my chest. My hands trembled, not from anger, but from something deeper, a mix of disbelief and an ache that words couldn't touch. I opened the drawer near the workbench and pulled out an old photograph. Mary was in it, holding Daniel on her lap, the two of them smiling like the world was kind and simple. I ran my thumb over the faded edges over her face, then his. The silence in the house wasn't empty. It was full of everything that used to be said. "Mary," I whispered, my voice catching in the stillness, "maybe it's time to teach him one last thing." I didn't mean a lesson in anger or revenge. No, that wasn't me. What I meant was quieter, something only time and distance could carve. Just like wood, some lessons need to be shaped slowly with patience until they hold. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the maple tree I planted when Daniel was born was turning red with fall. The light caught its leaves, and for a second I thought of how love changes shape, how sometimes it needs to let go to be seen again. I exhaled, long and steady. Then I smiled, just barely. "All right, son," I murmured. "You want space, let's see what you do with it." The clock kept ticking. The air smelled faintly of varnish and old dreams. That night, as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I felt something shift inside me, not bitterness, but clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just knew this wasn't the end of a home. It was the start of a lesson he'd remember long after I was gone. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's the sound of something bigger beginning. And if you've ever felt pushed aside by those you love, stay a while, listen on. Because this story, this one might be yours too. If stories like this speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe. We tell quiet stories about strength, The kind you don't shout about but you feel deep down. The next morning I drove out to my old workshop, the one that still smelled of cedar and sweat. The saws hadn't been used in years, but everything inside felt like muscle memory, quiet, solid, dependable. Mark Davis was already there, sitting on a stool with his coffee. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes narrowing the way old friends do when they are afraid to ask the real question. "So he said that to you?" I nodded, setting my thermos down on the table. "Yeah, word for word." Mark let out a low whistle and shook his head. "Man, I remember when that boy couldn't hammer a nail straight. Guess the world really does spin fast when you're young and proud." I gave him a small smile. "I guess I've built one too many roofs for others to stand under." For a while, neither of us said anything. We just listened to the wind outside and the faint creak of the rafters overhead. He finally reached into his bag and pulled out a thick folder. "I brought your old property file," he said. "I figured it might come in handy." He flipped through the papers, his finger running along the lines. "House is in your name. No co-owner, no lien, no debt." He looked up. "That means if he's pushing you out emotionally, you have every right to walk out legally." I didn't answer right away. My hands rested on the table, tracing invisible lines on the wood grain. Mark waited, patient as always. "But I'll walk out on my own terms," I said finally. "No shouting, no revenge, just clarity." Mark studied me, then smiled in that quiet, approving way only old friends can. "That's the Henry I remember, stubborn as oak." "Steady as oak," I corrected, grinning just a little. I left the workshop with that folder under my arm and the faint hum of old plans turning into new ones. At home, I sat down at my desk, pulled out my leather notebook and began sketching, a habit I never quite lost. But instead of building plans, I was drawing lines around pieces of my life. In one column I wrote, "Keep." In another, "Give away." And a third, "Let go." I paused after each word, staring at the page as if the ink could answer something I didn't yet understand. Through the window I saw Mrs. Bowen, my neighbor of 30 years, watering her hydrangeas. She caught sight of me through the glass and waved, her face full of concern. A few minutes later she was knocking gently on the open door. "Morning, Mr. Clark," she said, stepping halfway inside. "Saw you with those boxes yesterday. You're not leaving us, are you?" I looked at her, smiling faintly. "Not leaving, Mrs. Bowen. Just rearranging who owns the silence in this house." Her eyes softened, but she didn't quite know what to say. She touched my arm lightly before heading back outside. I watched her go, thinking how rare it was these days for anyone to notice the small shifts in another person's life. That afternoon, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out an old card. It was the business card of a real estate agent I'd met years ago when helping a friend sell their place. I ran my thumb across the fading ink. When I called, her voice was still the same, calm, efficient, polite. "Mr. Clark, how can I help you?" "I might have a house for sale," I said softly. Then after a pause, "But no one in the family needs to know yet." There was a silence on the line, the kind that says more than words. "Understood," she replied. "I'll keep it discreet." After I hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the phone. My heart didn't race and my hands didn't shake. Instead, there was this strange calm settling in, like the kind you feel right before a storm when the air is still but alive. Outside, the sun began to dip behind the trees, painting long shadows across the porch. I thought of Daniel again, of his voice the night before, so certain, so cold. Well, maybe it was time he learned that silence could speak too. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I knew exactly what I needed to do. The day after I called the agent, I stood in the middle of my living room with a tape measure in one hand and an empty box in the other. The house smelled faintly of pine and polish, that same scent I used to call home. Every corner carried a piece of my story. The table Mary and I built our first winter here. The chair Daniel broke jumping off it when he was 6. The shelf that never quite sat straight. When Nina, the real estate agent, arrived, she took one long look around and said, half smiling, "Mr. Clark, I've sold a lot of homes, but I can tell this one has a heartbeat. Why sell what you built with your own hands?" I leaned against the doorway, wiping dust from my palms. "Because hands can rebuild," I said quietly, "but a heart tired of disrespect can't." She didn't say anything after that, just nodded, professional and understanding, the way people do when they know not to ask too much. After she left, I started boxing things up. Each sound, the scrape of the tape, the click of the scissors felt like punctuation marks on a story coming to an end. I labeled the first box "Keep," the next for "Donation." The handwriting was shaky but steady. I paused at my old workbench, the one cluttered with half-finished carvings. One was a small wooden bird, wings half spread. I picked it up, brushed the sawdust off, and smiled. "You'll make someone else happy," I whispered. That afternoon, I loaded my truck with a few of those boxes and drove to the community center downtown. It was the kind of place with peeling paint but good hearts inside. A few retirees were fixing donated furniture in the corner. Others were chatting over instant coffee. When I walked in carrying that handmade table, they looked at me curiously. The woman at the desk smiled. "That's beautiful work," she said. "Are you donating it?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Made it myself a long time ago. It's time it belonged to someone who will use it." They gathered around as I set it down. I ran my hand along the smooth grain, remembering every groove and dent. Then I looked up at them, faces that carried decades of stories, same as mine. "Don't wait for your children to value your work," I told them. "Show them it's worth yourself." For a moment, no one spoke. Then a few people clapped, soft at first, then stronger. One man said, "You're right. We build so much for others we forget what it's like to build for ourselves." We ended up talking for a while about kids who don't visit enough, about projects that never got finished, about the strange peace that comes when you finally stop expecting gratitude. When I left, one of them patted my shoulder and said, "You're not just giving away wood, you're giving back courage." Back home, the light had started to fade, washing the house in a soft gold. I walked through each room slowly, taking in what would soon no longer be mine. The memories were everywhere: Mary's laughter in the kitchen, Daniel's small footprints near the hallway. But instead of feeling hollow, I felt something else, lighter. Later that week, Nina called. "There's a young couple who'd like to see the place," she said. When they arrived, I greeted them at the door. They couldn't have been older than 30, full of that hopeful energy I used to know. The woman ran her fingers along the banister. "It's beautiful," she said. "Thank you," I replied. "I built it back when everything was new." They walked through the rooms, asking about the wood, the foundation, the backyard view. I answered each question carefully, like introducing them to old friends. Watching them, I realized they weren't just seeing a house. They were seeing a future the same way I once did. When they finally left, they turned back at the porch. "We'll be in touch," the husband said with a smile. As their car disappeared down the road, I stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing, eyes tracing the long line of sunset. The quiet felt different now, not the kind that hurt, but the kind that heals. I took a deep breath, the scent of sawdust still hanging in the air, and whispered to myself, I wasn't just selling wood and nails. I was reclaiming what respect felt like. The wind moved through the trees as if it agreed. It started with a phone call Henry never expected. He was sanding down the last piece of oak in his shop when the phone buzzed. Mark's voice came through steady but tight. Henry, your son just tried to use your name. He walked into the bank with forged power of attorney papers. I stopped the paperwork before it went through. For a second, Henry didn't move. The sandpaper slipped from his hand and hit the floor. The sound was small, but it echoed like thunder in the quiet shop. Thanks, Mark, he said finally, voice low. I'll handle it. By the time Henry pulled into the driveway, Daniel's car was already there, parked sideways, door half open. He stormed out the moment his father stepped from the truck. So it's true, Daniel shouted. You're selling the house. You're gonna take everything from me. Henry looked at him, really looked, and for a moment he didn't see the angry man in front of him. He saw the little boy who used to run barefoot through this same yard, carrying a toy hammer and calling himself Dad's helper. I'm not taking anything from you, son, he said quietly. You just forgot to give anything back. Daniel froze, caught off guard. His jaw clenched, but his eyes flickered, unsure. You think you can just walk away, after everything? Henry stepped closer, his voice steady but soft. I walked toward you my whole life. You were just too busy walking past me to notice. The words hung there, heavy but true. Then came the knock on the door. 2 police officers stood outside, calm and professional. Mr. Clark, we received a report about a potential property dispute. Henry nodded. Of course, officers, come in. He laid out every document, title, deed, receipts neatly on the kitchen table. His movements were slow, deliberate. Years of craftsmanship had taught him that steady hands could solve almost anything. Daniel watched, his face shifting from anger to something else, fear maybe, regret beginning to crack through the pride. One officer examined the papers, then looked at Daniel. Sir, these are all valid. The property belongs solely to your father. Daniel didn't say a word, he just stared at the floor. Mrs. Bowen, who had been standing by her porch across the street, slowly walked closer. She'd seen it all from her window. The shouting, the flashing lights, the man who'd once brought her fresh wood chips for her garden now standing so small beside his father. She looked at Henry, eyes soft and sad. I've never seen a man lose his son twice in one lifetime, she whispered. Henry's lips trembled slightly, but he didn't reply. He simply gave her a faint nod. Then, with the officers gone and Daniel silent, he went back inside. At his desk, he picked up his pen, signed the sale authorization, and slid it into the envelope for Mark. The sound of the pen scratching paper was calm, final, like the last stroke of a carving that's taken a lifetime to finish. He didn't slam doors or raise his voice. He just sealed the envelope and set it beside the phone. Outside, Daniel sat in his car for a long time. Through the window, Henry could see his son gripping the steering wheel, shoulders trembling. Maybe anger, maybe shame. Maybe both, but Henry didn't go after him. For the first time in years, he chose not to fix what someone else broke. As the car finally pulled away, the night settled in around the house. Henry turned off the lights one by one, his reflection following him in the dark glass. In the quiet, his voice drifted, soft, reflective, almost like a prayer. When you stop trying to be heard, he said, you start to be understood in ways that echo louder. And somewhere out on that empty road, he hoped the echo might still reach his son. When the letter came from the court, Henry didn't even open it right away. He knew what it was before he saw the words. Laura had gone through with it, hired a lawyer, filed a petition saying he was no longer of sound mind. The phrase itself almost made him laugh. After all these years, after every decision carefully weighed and every bill paid to the cent, now they called him unfit to know his own name. The knock on the door came 2 days later. A young woman stood there, clipboard in hand, polite but cautious. "Mr. Clark, I'm from Adult Protective Services. I just need to ask you a few questions." Henry smiled, stepping aside. "Of course, come in. I've got nothing to hide except my woodworking mess." She followed him through the living room, taking notes as her eyes darted from the neat rows of labeled boxes to the stacks of ledgers on his desk. He offered her tea, but she declined. "Just routine procedure," she said, her tone rehearsed. Henry opened a folder and slid it across the table. "That's my tax file for the last 7 years, and these are my donation receipts. I've been contributing to the local community center. Here's the title for the house, paid in full, no liens, no debt." The woman blinked, caught a little off guard. "You've kept everything very organized." Henry gave a half smile. "I build furniture for a living. Straight lines make sense to me." He paused, then looked her in the eye. "If madness means knowing my worth, then maybe I'm crazy after all." She smiled, not the professional kind, but a small human one. "I think you'll be just fine, Mr. Clark." When she left, the house went quiet again, too quiet. Henry stood there for a moment, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade down the porch. He walked out to the workshop. The afternoon light slanted through the dusty air, catching on floating sawdust like tiny sparks. It was the same kind of light that used to fall across Mary's shoulders when she'd stand there watching him work, humming some old tune from the radio. He reached over to the dusty shelf, turned the dial, and after a bit of static, the same song played, her song. The melody filled the room, soft, steady, familiar. He closed his eyes, and for a moment she was there again. The memory came not as a flash, but as a whisper, her voice warm and patient. If he ever forgets kindness, don't argue, let life remind him. Henry swallowed hard, the corners of his mouth trembling into something between a smile and a sigh. "Maybe this is it, Mary," he whispered. Life reminding him. He sat down at the bench, the song still playing low in the background. In his lap was an old flannel shirt, one of his favorites, torn at the sleeve. He threaded a needle and began to stitch it slowly, carefully, the way he used to fix Daniel's clothes when the boy was small. Each stitch pulled through the fabric with a quiet rhythm matching the beat of the song. The workshop creaked softly around him, alive yet still. He wasn't angry anymore. Not at Daniel, not at Laura, not at the life that had turned in on itself. Just tired in a peaceful way, the kind of tired you feel when you finally stop fighting for people to see what's already true. Outside, the light shifted, the day dimming toward dusk. Henry tied off the last thread, smoothed the sleeve flat, and laid the shirt across his knees. He didn't know what the court would say or what lies would come next. But sitting there in that quiet room, he knew one thing for sure. He hadn't lost his mind. He'd simply stopped giving it away. The morning of the handover was bright, the kind of cold, clear light that makes everything feel sharper than usual. Henry stood by the porch, hands resting on the railing he'd sanded down himself years ago. The air smelled faintly of varnish and early autumn leaves. Mark pulled up in his truck first, carrying the paperwork and his ever-present calm. "You ready?" he asked. Henry nodded, though his eyes were fixed on the house. "Ready as I'll ever be." The young couple, the buyers, arrived next. They were polite, nervous, excited in that way people are when they are about to start something new. Henry greeted them with a gentle smile, showing them where to sign, explaining the quirks of the place like he was saying goodbye to old friends. Just as Mark opened his briefcase to finalize the last signature, the crunch of tires broke the quiet. A silver SUV pulled into the driveway. Out stepped Daniel, suit pressed, jaw tight, followed by a lawyer clutching a manila folder. Daniel's voice came out sharp, cutting through the calm morning. "Stop everything. This transaction is under legal dispute." The lawyer held up a printed order. "Temporary injunction filed last night." Henry didn't flinch. Mark, always prepared, adjusted his glasses and took the paper from the lawyer's hand. He skimmed it once, twice, then exhaled through his nose and opened his own folder. "Actually," Mark said evenly, "that order was reviewed by Judge Simmons an hour ago, declared invalid due to lack of standing." He read aloud the clause, his voice steady and deliberate. "All rights of ownership remain with Mr. Henry Clark until the moment of transfer, which is now." The silence that followed was thick. Even the wind seemed to pause. Daniel blinked, his bravado slipping. "You really sold it after everything, this house, everything you built?" Henry met his eyes. There was no anger there, no gloating, just a kind of weary grace. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't sell it. I just gave it back to peace." Mark slid the final document toward him. Henry picked up the pen, the same one he'd used to sign the mortgage decades ago, and wrote his name for the last time. The buyers extended their hands, gratitude and reverence in their faces. When Henry handed over the keys, the sunlight caught the brass and flashed across his palm, like a final spark of something once burning bright. Mrs. Bowen was standing by the gate, a small crowd of neighbors and a local reporter beside her. She watched the exchange with misty eyes and said softly, "He didn't lose a home. He reclaimed a life." The young couple smiled at her words, but Henry didn't turn around. He just walked to his old pickup, the engine coughing before it settled into its familiar rumble. As he drove away, he caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. Daniel standing in the middle of the yard, motionless, the morning light spilling around him. Henry's grip tightened slightly on the wheel, but his eyes softened. The house grew smaller behind him until it disappeared completely, swallowed by distance and the glow of the rising sun. For the first time in years, he didn't feel heavy. He didn't feel wronged, just free. He rolled down the window, let the cool air rush in, and whispered to himself, "Peace, that's all it ever needed to be." The house was empty when Daniel returned. The echo of his footsteps followed him down the hallway like ghosts that hadn't figured out they were gone. The air was still thick with sawdust, and when the sunset light streamed through the bare windows, it caught the dust in the air, tiny golden specks swirling like memories that refused to settle. He stopped at the doorway of what used to be his father's workshop. The smell of pine and oil still lingered there, faint but unmistakable. Everything was gone except for the old wooden table and a single envelope resting right in the center. The handwriting on it was steady, deliberate. For Daniel from Dad. His hands shook as he picked it up. He slid his finger under the flap, pulling out a photograph first. It was old, faded at the corners, creased where it had been carried for years. He recognized it instantly. Him, no older than 6, sitting on his father's shoulders, both of them grinning like fools, sawdust in their hair. Behind the photo was a folded note, written in the same neat, careful hand. "You once said I was in your way, but all I ever wanted was to walk beside you." Daniel's throat tightened. He read it again, then again, as if the words might change, but they didn't. They just sank deeper. He sank to his knees, the letter trembling in his hands, and for the first time in years the tears came. They came hard, years of pride and anger collapsing all at once. His sobs echoed off the walls, raw and unfiltered, the kind of sound that only comes from realizing too late what should have mattered all along. He pressed the photo against his chest, whispering through the tears, "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry." Outside, the light was fading fast. He stepped out onto the porch, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. The trees his father had planted years ago lined the yard, their leaves rustling in the evening wind. He looked up at them, at the quiet rows of strength his father had left behind, and for a long time he just stood there breathing, listening. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Dad, I understand now." The wind stirred gently, brushing against his cheek like an unseen hand, and somewhere in that silence he almost swore he heard his father's voice, soft, steady, proud, carried away with the falling light. A year passed. The seasons had done their work, washing the anger away, sanding down the rough edges of grief, leaving something smoother, quieter. Henry's new workshop sat on the edge of town, behind an old brick building that smelled of sawdust and sunshine. The sign above the door was hand-carved, letters simple and honest, Clark's Free Woodcraft School. Inside, laughter mixed with the sound of chisels tapping against wood. A few older folks hunched over their projects, careful and proud, while a handful of teenagers worked nearby, awkward at first but eager. Henry moved between them, steady and calm, correcting a grip here, guiding a stroke there. A young boy, maybe 12, frowned over a stubborn piece of cedar. Henry crouched beside him, voice soft. "You're rushing it," he said. "Wood remembers patience, so should people." The boy looked up, puzzled at first, then smiled. "Yes, sir." Henry smiled back. "Good, try again." That same morning across town, Laura sat in her kitchen flipping through the local paper. A headline caught her eye. "Retired carpenter opens free workshop, teaching dignity through wood." She froze, staring at the photo, Henry in his worn flannel shirt, sawdust on his sleeves, smiling beside a group of kids. For a moment, her throat tightened. She folded the paper gently, setting it aside, her eyes distant as if something in her heart had quietly unclenched. Later that week, Henry received a small envelope in the mail. The handwriting was clumsy, the kind only a child could make. It read, "From Emma." He opened it carefully, unfolding the lined paper inside. "Grandpa, Dad showed me the picture you left. He says you're the strongest man he knows." Henry sat there for a long while, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your lips right away, but grows from somewhere deep inside. The late afternoon light spilled through the workshop windows, glinting off the dust motes that danced in the air. In that golden quiet, his voice came not out loud, but inside like a whisper to the heart. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give others. It's the space you make inside yourself to breathe again. He folded the letter, slipped it into his pocket, and stood. The sound of hammering and laughter filled the room again. Henry walked toward the open door, the sun dipping low, painting everything in shades of gold. The rhythm of tools echoed around him, steady, human, alive. He picked up a chisel, joined the others, and the sound of wood meeting purpose filled the air. For the first time in a long while, Henry wasn't rebuilding a house. He was rebuilding a life. "If you've ever loved someone who forgot your worth," the voiceover murmured, gentle and sure, "remember, silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's the echo that teaches others what they never heard." On screen, words appeared against the fading light. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of respect, forgiveness, and quiet strength. Subscribe like family shadows and the sound of a wooden chisel carried softly into the fade out.